what to do because I'm really scared I'm gonna pass out. But I see a road below me that I've been able to hear for a while, and I'm thinking about going to the road, but I also don't want to get off the trail in case I pass out. I don't want them to find me.
So, growing up in Tennessee, we were always told of the Appalachian feral people. It indicated that there is a group of individuals that during the Great Depression decided that it would be better to live off the land in the mountains of East Tennessee and western North Carolina.
In the summer of 1989, a pair of hikers vanished in the Great Smoky Mountains along the Tennessee-North Carolina border. A young couple from Ohio set out to explore the backcountry trails around Cades Cove, only to disappear without a trace. Initially, their fate was attributed to inexperience and a lack of preparation for the rugged, unforgiving terrain of the southern Appalachians.
Through the years, hundreds of people have been lost in the Great Smoky Mountains. Some for just a few hours, some for days, but in modern history, only 4 still remain missing decades later. One of them, a 16-year-old girl who disappeared on a school hike.
Rangers launched an extensive search after finding their car abandoned in the parking lot at the trailhead, but not a single item, no backpack, no scrap of clothing, turned up in the vast, decaying wilderness. Over the next few years, the number of missing persons cases grew, always solo hikers, or couples who strayed from the marked trails into remote gorges and hollows where Park Service patrols were scarce. In total, around a dozen people had disappeared, far exceeding the usual statistical odds. Something was off. By the mid-90s, rumors spread through the small towns surrounding the Smokies about what might be happening in the untracked depths of the misty, jungle-like mountains. Old-timers shared eerie folk tales around campfires, their stories unsettling even the most rational park rangers and Forest Service workers. This part of the Appalachians had long concealed isolated pockets of people. Entire clans and families, referred to as holler dwellers or brush apes by the more civilized locals, who had lived deep in the wilderness for countless generations, far removed from modern society. They occupied valleys and caverns so remote that even the most experienced hikers couldn't reach them, leaving their way of life shrouded in mystery. These nearly mythical stories spoke of centuries of inbreeding, with some individuals so far removed from the modern world that they had become something else entirely. The chilling tales told of unspeakable acts, cannibalism, sinister rituals, and the worship of strange deities or cursed relics that no sane person should ever witness. The old mountain men and shamans insisted that even the word holler itself came from an ancient Cherokee term, one that, if spoken, could draw the attention of the savage, inbred hordes lurking between the dense ridges and creek beds, ready to snatch away anyone who wandered too close. Such stories were whispered far from the ears of tourists and outsiders, kept hidden to avoid scaring away the steady stream of money flowing into the roadside hotels and souvenir shops. But for those who had grown up in the area, the darkness hanging over the Great Smokies was as real as the thick wood smoke curling above dying moonshine stills. Only the most seasoned and sharp-eyed rangers gave any weight to these backwoods superstitions, yet the number of missing persons reports continued to climb year after year. It wasn't until the summer of 2001 that enough tangible evidence surfaced to lend real credibility to the grim legends. That was when a militant environmental activist, Amanda Willis, who had just come off the Appalachian Trail on a personal sabbatical to, as she put it, reconnect with the spirit of the forest womb, according to her blog, went missing. Willis was no amateur. She was an experienced survivalist, well aware of the dangers and rhythms of the wilderness. So when she failed to emerge from the mountains at her scheduled endpoint and missed her planned rendezvous, immediate alarms were raised. This was not an ordinary disappearance, nor the case of an unprepared nature lover getting lost. Something far more disturbing had happened. Her gear was top-tier military grade, essentially a mobile base camp's worth of supplies and communication equipment, allowing her to upload trail photos and microblogs from the field as she moved, until her final transmission came from the northwest, near the upper headwaters of the Chola River, in one of the most remote sectors of the Smokies. Accompanying the post was an image that initially appeared to show an elk or bear carcass on the riverbank ahead. But when authorities examined the fine details of that last photo through intense magnification and contrast enhancement, they determined that Willis may have come across the remains of a human skeleton, one that seemed crushed and fractured, its bones embedded in the black, rocky soil, as if discarded by a creature far larger and more powerful than anything that should exist in nature. That was when the heavy hitters were brought in. Search and rescue emergency response teams from county, state, and even federal law enforcement agencies launched a manhunt for Willis at an unprecedented scale, not seen since Dennis Martin's disappearance in 1969. Operating under the assumption that the activist had unknowingly become prey for a highly coordinated hunting party, wave after wave of armed teams were airlifted into the most remote hollows and ravines. The rangers strongly advised them to steer clear of areas said to be inhabited by the holler beings. What followed over the next 2 blistering summer months, as GD combed through the briar ivy-choked wilderness of the Smokies, was nothing short of a waking nightmare. Even the most seasoned agents, fresh off high-risk SWAT operations in Chicago and New York City, began uncovering the unburied remains of other missing persons. The grisly discoveries left no doubt. They had been dragged from their forest graves and consumed in an unspeakable manner. Flesh had been stripped clean from bone, the scattered remains discarded with the same casual disregard as a diner brushing breadcrumbs from his beard, at least to the trained eyes of forensic examiners and cadaver dogs. There was no question that these painstakingly reconstructed skeletons belonged to hikers and campers who had long haunted missing persons case files. Any lingering hopes that a rogue grizzly or a deranged killer was responsible were quickly shattered by the unmistakable signs of ritualistic mutilation. The horror only deepened as contact was finally made with the ultra-reclusive Holler clan suspected to be behind the attacks and gruesome rituals. As recovery squads pushed further into the vine-strangled ravines and near-vertical canyons, they found themselves firing upon what could only be described as subhuman mutants. These creatures lived in nests made of debris, clustering together in shrieking, camouflaged masses. Reports described them as naked, their twisted bodies covered in animal pelts and fungal lesions, products of centuries of extreme inbreeding. They had regressed so far from any recognizable human form that they moved hunched and knuckle-dragging, their mouths filled with razor-like teeth, and their massive, milky eyes displaying no recognition or understanding as they were fired upon from helicopter gunships hovering above. Though the initial confrontations inflicted heavy losses on these mutant hill clans, forcing them to scatter under relentless gunfire deeper into the mountain's tangled root systems, officers on the ground reported a sinking dread. For every one of these creatures that fell, dozens more seemed to remain hidden, burrowed into the twisted, bark-woven fed-ed hive nest, clinging to prehistoric rock formations in areas no surveyor had ever mapped. At the same time, the frequency of their gruesome sacrifices only became more elaborate and ceremonial, their reign of terror stretching on. The full scope of their horrific appetites was revealed through meticulously arranged bone pits, containing the remains of men, women, and children alike, arranged as if to commemorate each kill. Any misguided belief that these were sentient criminals who could be prosecuted was abandoned in the face of undeniable reality. This was not a lost tribe of mankind's descendants, but something far worse, its inbred, cannibalistic predecessors. For while civilization had long extended its reach through law, religion, science, and philosophy, these pockets of wild Appalachia had remained untouched. Beyond the Black Sea, a world of prehistoric brutality, these feral hunter-gatherers saw wealthy hikers and nature lovers wandering into their domain not as fellow humans, but as prey. To them, these unsuspecting outsiders were nothing more than meat to be honored on their blood-stained altars, devoured in rituals that had endured since the dawn of time. With the situation spiraling out of control, and all attempts at communication or negotiation with these ever-present holler tribes proving useless against their deafened, animal-like ears, the decision was swiftly made to withdraw all operational teams and implement a scorched earth evacuation under emergency presidential statutes. A 100-square-mile stretch of the Great Smoky's interior was forcibly cleared and designated a temporary no-man's land, marked by the Cholla Ridge Line and extending down to the Appalachian Trail. Entire vacation hamlets were abandoned, their businesses and rental cabins seized under eminent domain, as air superiority assets transformed the area into a militarized hot zone for the first time since the Civil War. Mustard gas and phosphorus rained down upon the thick Appalachian hills in a bid to strip the land bare and force the holler clans into retreat. As the summer haze hung wet and toxic over the smoldering ridge lines, helicopter gunships raked the scorched clearings and cliffsides with relentless machine gun fire, leaving nothing alive and erasing any trace of the holler tribe's existence, human or otherwise. But for those who gazed down into the impenetrable darkness beneath the toxic mist and gunfire, one question lingered. Had this been the final reckoning with a long, isolated pocket of humanity's worst regression? Or had the holler inbreds simply vanished into the depths once more, slipping back into the prehistoric abyss where they had dwelled for eons, continuing their depraved existence undetected? As they withdrew, winding barriers of barbed wire sealed off what became known as the Great Smoky's Interior Operations Zone. Footprints in the gray ash hinted at something unnatural, distorted bear-like tracks pressed into the same soil not long before. Then, from deep within the woods, beyond even the reach of artillery, strange drums began to echo, accompanied by eerie, discordant wails. Something ancient stirred within the last lightless hollows. This was far from over. Now, deep in the ancient hollows of the southern Appalachians, where mist clings to mountain laurel and creeks murmur with voices from the unseen, a legend has haunted mountain folk for generations. It is the story of the Bone Eater, a creature born of darkness and summoned through the darkest witchcraft to roam these cursed hills and hollers on an endless hunt, not for flesh, but for the very bones that shape a living body. The elders say the Bone Eater was once human, but was twisted inside out by an insatiable greed, warping into a being consumed by its hunger for skeletal remains. With every bone it devoured, its form grew more grotesque, its cravings spiraling beyond control. Some claim the Bone Eater's origins trace back to the Trail of Tears in the 1830s, when the Cherokee Nation was driven west by President Jackson's soldiers, forced through 1,000 miles of brutal winter wilderness. As the starving masses passed through these mountains, whispers spread that a desperate shaman made a deal with the unspeakable force dwelling in the hollows to preserve what little remained of his people. The price of this bargain was allowing an ancient bone-eating demon to roam free once more, a primordial entity from an era before the first ember of human civilization cast its glow. In this version, the shaman had no choice but to unleash the horror or risk his people being wiped from existence. Others believe the Bone Eater was the horrific creation of settlers who followed Daniel Boone's trail through the Cumberland Gap in the 1770s. They say the Old World folk magic of Scots-Irish immigrants mixed with Native American shamanic rituals, birthing an abomination that fed on the bones of both struggling settlements and any unfortunate indigenous villages that crossed its path. Whichever story is true, all agree on one thing. Josiah McCormack, a weathered old hunter and trapper from Wolf Creek Holler, was one such man, pushing 90 years old when he retold his encounter to anyone willing to listen over sips of his morning whiskey. It happened during the summer of 1961, when McCormack was still a strong young man, doing whatever it took to put food on his family's table. He had tracked deep into the hollows, following the darkest, most secluded game trails, when he found himself surrounded by what he initially thought were stumps and fallen logs. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the holler, he realized those shapes were anything but trees. Bones, scattered in every direction. It moved with an unnatural gait, limbs twisted and stretched too long, its body wrapped in filthy rags and scraps of fur. But what struck him the most was its face, blank except for a slack tongue, and rows of teeth made from polished bones, gleaming like pearls. That was the moment he knew, deep in his soul, what he was looking at: the Bone Eater, the curse of these hills, now standing before him, ready to claim him as its next victim. Only McCormack's instincts and steady aim saved him that evening. As the creature lunged toward him, he raised his shotgun and let off a blast of double-aught buckshot straight into its chest at point-blank range. The abomination let out a shriek and stumbled back into the underbrush, but it wasn't dead. Not by a long shot. That's Jake and Adam, heading off-trail into the Nantahala National Forest. A few days away from the grind, some hiking, maybe some smoking. Just a break from the monotony of life. We had no idea what we were walking into. We left Asheville on Friday afternoon, music blasting, and the first beer of the trip already kicking in. A couple of hours later, after navigating Warport Fire Row, we found what looked like the perfect campsite. A flat clearing surrounded by towering rhododendrons and dense pines. It seemed ideal at first, but as the last light of the spring sunset faded, things started to feel off. Not long after we pitched our tents and got a fire going, strange noises broke the evening quiet. These weren't the usual animal calls. They were yells and inhuman shrieks echoing through the hills. "Yo, did you guys hear that?" Jake asked, head tilted. Another eerie cry cut through the night. We strained our eyes, scanning the tree line. The shifting shadows made it hard to see, but something was there. "Probably just some coyotes," Adam said, laughing nervously. Another high-pitched wail rang out, but deep down, we knew. This wasn't coyotes. A mist crept in as the night wore on, muting our conversation. Every cry from the woods made us inch closer to the fire. Around 11 p.m., Jake got up to take a leak. We had been drinking, so none of us thought much of it when he wandered off. That is, until we heard a branch snap, followed by a shocked yelp and a heavy thud. My stomach dropped. Adam and I froze, listening as something thrashed in the darkness. "Jake, you good?" Adam called, his voice unsteady. A moment later, Jake's screams tore through the night. The sound of ripping flesh and wet, snarling breaths followed. We grabbed whatever we could for weapons, a couple of beer bottles, a log from the fire, and sprinted into the woods. What we found was something out of a nightmare. Jake lay in a heap, blood pooling beneath him. A creature hunched over his body, tearing into him with its bare hands. When our flashlights hit it, it jerked its head toward us. It had a stretched, hairless face with human-like features, but its mouth was filled with jagged teeth, bared in a twisted grimace. The second the light touched it, it hissed and recoiled. I wish I could forget what Jake looked like in those last moments. His face locked in terror, eyes bulging, mouth open in a silent scream. His insides were being devoured before our eyes. Adam and I bolted back to camp. Behind us, the thing let out a howl, and others answered. More were coming. Any thought of gathering our gear vanished as we heard branches snapping and something crashing through the underbrush. Then, one of them burst from the trees. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, its limbs long and unnatural. It ran on all fours, faster than anything should be able to move. Adam swung his branch with everything he had, cracking it across the thing's head. It barely reacted. We ran. The sounds of pursuit closed in, their cries bouncing off the hills. Our flight through the woods was a blur of ripping branches, bleeding hands, and pure terror. At one point, I glanced back and saw one of them standing on a ridge, silhouetted by the moon. It let out a wail, so loud, so piercing, that for a second I thought my body would just shut down from the sheer horror of it. It didn't feel like a sound. It felt like something sinking into me, invading every cell of my body. We didn't stop. We didn't listen. We ran until the trees thinned and the gravel road came into view. Just before we collapsed onto the trailhead, I made the mistake of looking back one last time. Dozens of them stood at the edge of the woods, their glowing yellow eyes locked on us. Their arms were spread wide, fingers twitching, their bodies thin and misshapen. Whatever they weren't animals. They weren't even human. And they didn't belong to this world. On the long drive back to Asheville, we hardly spoke. Just the low hum of the engine, the chirping of crickets, and our own ragged breaths slicing through the heavy night air. Tried digging up first-hand accounts, verifiable records, even obscure folklore about these feral, wild people haunting the rugged hill country and hidden corners of the southern Appalachians, and you'll come up frustratingly empty. Too many missing person cases in those woods, never explained, too many hushed whispers of old Native American tales that feel far too real, too many grim, buried chapters of our nation's past, rewritten to fit the comfort of polite society. They're out there, waiting, whether we choose to accept their twisted, unnatural existence or not. A grotesque fusion of raw, untamed nature and the darkest recesses of human ancestry, left to fester and morph in those unseen hollows for centuries. Whatever hunted Adam and me that night felt wrong in a way that defied modern science, warped, deranged, as if pure malice had taken on flesh and bone, ignoring the rules of physics, evolution, and biology as we know them. All I know is that I count myself unbelievably lucky to have made it out of those cursed woods mostly intact, all things considered. Every morning, I give thanks to fate, to chance, to some unknown force, that I outran whatever nightmare lurks in that abyss, an apex predator perfected over countless ages in the shadows. But every time my mind drifts back to that moment, to the sight of Jake's remains desecrated beyond comprehension, I regret not staying long enough to burn that whole God-forsaken forest to its roots, to scorch the very land itself, until not even a whisper of that ancient evil could rise again. Maybe then, even if only for a brief moment, the horrors buried in the deepest, darkest corners of our world would have been held at bay. Maybe, just maybe, those southern wilds would have been spared from whatever nameless corruption keeps birthing those ravenous things from the abyss, hidden deep within the Appalachian wilderness. We like to believe we are civilized, that we have conquered the world around us. But deep down, every person knows the truth. A lingering dread, an instinctual certainty that something unspeakable, born from nature's most abhorrent depths, still lingers just beyond the hills, just past the next ridgeline, waiting in the silence. It watches, grinning, its jagged teeth bared, moss and decay dripping from its maw, after centuries of festering in the forgotten places where mankind has no claim. So, what are your thoughts on these mysteries? Let us know in the comments below, and subscribe for more content.